friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And yes, it's another Vinegar Q and A because I keep getting lots of questions. And you know what? It's a good idea for me to refresh this every once in a while, especially for those who are new. And so I'll probably be covering a lot of the same stuff I've covered in previous videos like this, but I'm hoping to clear up a few other things as well while I'm at it. So I do have a whole long list of many ways that you can make vinegar and showing all the many different types of vinegars you can make, whether it be using flowers or trees or fruits or even garlic and oregano. So you can see, you can look at my playlist, and I'll make sure I link to it down in the description box below. Don't forget to hit show more so you can check some of those out. But keep in mind, some of the early videos I was making vinegar different, even though I'd already been doing it for quite a while. I make it a little differently now than I did back then, but it still is a doable method whichever way you want to do it. Now the way I used to do it was I would just put in my fruit, herbs, whatever, and my water and my sugar, and just cover it with a cloth and then leave it be for about 30 days and just forget about it. Now what I do, I try to make the habit of stirring it at least every couple of days or so. And what that does is that helps prevent mold and helps aerate it as well. Now, mold is not an issue, so let's start with that. A lot of people get very concerned when they go, maybe they were thinking of stirring their vinegar every day and they forgot about it, and they go back and they find mold on top, as can be seen in this picture that I got from one of our subscribers right here. And they developed mold on the top. This is common. In fact, I used to get frequently mold on some of my vinegars. Typically, it was most likely to happen on my peach vinegar, never on my raisin vinegar. However, it really depends when you develop that mold, it depends on how high up your fruit floats. If it's going to float up above the liquid, yes, it will get mold on top if you're not stirring it down. And that's not going to hurt anything. Even if you see black mold, it's not the same scary black mold that you hear about, you know, that's going to make everybody sick. All it is the same mold that was green initially, that aged, it dried out, it died, and it turned black. That's all it is. It's nothing to be afraid of. So if you forgot to stir if you didn't use weights and you forgot to stir your vinegar, simply lift that out and then strain out everything. Once it's all done, once the 30 days are up, and it's going to be fine. If any of that mold falls into the vinegar itself, and it is a good strong vinegar, it's going to kill the mold. It's nothing to be afraid of. However, to prevent the mold in the first place, the two things you can do are you can get weights. There's different ways you can weight it down. Some people like to use plastic, like a plastic bag, and put rocks or things in it that will, you know, so it will float, stay on top, but also weight everything down. But people who are trying to avoid the plastic, that using the Ziploc bag isn't a great idea. You can buy very expensive glass weights, which I personally I don't recommend it because I think it's personally a waste of money when it's a lot cheaper just to stir it. Or if you don't have time to stir it, don't worry about the mold. It's not something to be afraid of. But really, stirring I have found to be the best way to do it. You can stir it once a day, twice a day. You can even get away with 2 to 3 times a week and it'll be fine. So once you get your vinegar made, just make sure you have either stainless steel or a long wooden spoon or chopstick, and then bamboo is great, and then just stir that fruit down as it floats to the top of your vinegar. And as I said earlier, stirring it every day is going to aerate it. And aerating, what that does is that gets more oxygen worked down into the vinegar because it needs the oxygen for it to turn to vinegar. So that brings me to my next point, is I've had people contact me and say, what am I doing wrong? My vinegar tastes and smells like wine. What did I do wrong? Should I throw it out? Well, you didn't do anything wrong per se if you're wanting wine. Most likely what you did is you used an airlock on your vinegar, like one of those pickling pipes that people like to get for making certain things. That's not the way to go when you want to make vinegar. You need Your vinegar needs air, needs oxygen for it to become vinegar, otherwise you're making wine. So you can see back here in this corner, I've got my last gallon of apple wine brewing. It's just about done, and so I'll show you a close-up right here. This is the airlock. This is what it looks like when it's bubbling, and how that works is the airlock prevents oxygen from getting into the juice, but allows the gases to escape as it's fermenting. That's important, otherwise it's going to blow its top. So, but for it to become wine, it can't have any oxygen. So if wine is what you want, and airlock is what you need. But if vinegar is what you want, then what you simply do is cover it with a cloth and a rubber band. This is one of the reasons I don't like using weights and stuff on top of the vinegar, is to keep everything down, and why stirring is better is because it's going to help get more oxygen in there, where if you got the weights over that, you're just not getting enough oxygen in there for it to turn into a really good vinegar. You might still get vinegar, it might take longer, or it just might not be as strong. So the cloth, using the cloth, or like some people like to do, using a coffee filter, a paper coffee filter over that, and either way putting a rubber band. The reason for the coffee filter or the cloth is to keep dust and bugs out of it. Fruit flies especially are attracted to it, and so you want to try to keep those out. You can filter them out when it's all done, and it's not going to be a big deal, but still, who wants those in their vinegar? The other thing is, what I have here is, it's kind of folded over. This is a Vinegar Scobie I took off of my last. I don't normally save these, I usually throw them out to the chickens, but I decided this time I'm going to save one of them. You can use your Scobies from previous vinegar batches to start another batch if you want. I never do that. I just usually feed them to the chickens, but if you're making a vinegar that's maybe something more like an herb vinegar, or something that might need a little bit more to get it started, using your Scobie is a good idea, but I would say more important would be to add a little bit of vinegar from a previous batch, as long as it has some of that mother in it, some of the cloudy looking stuff, like you'll see at the bottom of this jar right here. This stuff down here is really good for getting vinegar started, but you can also see it has a Scobie growing on it. So this is some of my more recent apple vinegar that I had filtered out, and it's been sitting in there back in there for like a month, and so it's already growing another Scobie, even though it had one. Now, one thing you'll find is your fruit vinegars in particular, like pear and apple, are the ones most likely to form a Scobie on them while they're fermenting, while you're in the process of making it. None of my herbal ones are, it's very rare. Like here's a rose and rhubarb one. This one never got a Scobie, and it still hasn't developed one. In the apple ones, I find develop Scobies very quickly. But anyway, part of the reason I was showing this to you is that, let me pull this out so you can see it here, and I'll also be showing pictures, but this is what it looks like. It'll come in various thicknesses. It depends on the stage of development. It can be paper thin, or it can be as thick as this. I've actually had one this thick. I think it was on a peach vinegar, which, speaking of, right here is a peach vinegar, and this Scobie it's actually fairly thick. It's probably about an inch thick. You probably can't see it very good, but it was floating at the top, but sometimes when you jostle the jars around, they will sink down to the bottom, which is what this one did. So this one developed in storage. It wasn't, I always filter out the Scobies that developed on the fruit when I go to fill the jars, but a lot of times they'll develop Scobies in storage. This is normal and to be expected, especially in a good healthy vinegar. So it's nothing to be afraid of. So if you're new to vinegar making and you see something like this, kind of a white gelatinous thing or a beige gelatinous looking thing floating on the top, that's all it is. It's the Scobie, the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that has formed on the top. Totally normal and natural and very healthy. There's a lot you can do with that. Like I said, personally, all I ever do is throw it out to my chickens because I know it's very good for them. And they love it. It's a special little treat for them. Actually, I'm going to show you this again. In fact, I'll take a picture straight down. Another thing you'll often see is kind of a waxy, kind of little floaty pieces at the top. That again is also very normal. Sometimes what you're going to be seeing on there is going to be, if it looks powdery, it's simply cam yeast. And sometimes the little waxy looking stuff is simply the waxy parts that are coming off the fruits, that because most fruits have a natural waxy type layer to them. And that's really all it is. It's nothing to be concerned about. And these are the things I'm trying to clear up with people, that a lot of people think, oh no, I need to throw this out because it's this or that. And most likely, no, you don't need to throw it out. Now, if you had vinegar that turned to wine, it can still become vinegar. However, you may be better off starting over and using that, what you turned to wine, because you didn't know and you prevented oxygen from getting to it. Then use it in things that you would normally use wine in for cooking and baking, marinating and stuff like that. But you should be able to still turn it to vinegar, just covering it with a cloth and then letting it sit for another month. How vinegar is made is the yeast in there is going to convert the sugars. So you have to have sugar to make vinegar. So don't forget, that is very important. And that's why when you're doing herbal based vinegars, you really have to make sure you're using sugar. Or if you're doing, like say, an apple vinegar and you're just using the scraps, like the peels and the cores, you might not have enough sugar in those apple cores and peels to get a good vinegar. So you're going to still need to add sugar, like a quarter cup to a half cup to a half-gallon jar, you know, and you put that in there, you add your liquid. I'm gonna actually start some vinegar today so you can see what I do, and then add your sugar. Now, if you're using pure juice, yes, you can actually do this to make vinegar. You may not need to add any sugar at all. Just put your juice, cover it with a cloth, put a rubber band around it, and let it sit for 30 days. Now, in that case, if it's a juice that's been cooked in some way and it's not a raw juice, I recommend at that point then adding a Scobie from one of your vinegars, or even that little layer like you can see at the bottom of my Raisin Vinegar here. If you can get that, put some of that in there. That's going to help get it going, because most likely if the juice has already been cooked, then it's killed off all the yeast and stuff in there, and you want to make sure you get that in there so you can get that going and get it fermenting. So I'm going to start with a half-gallon jar. I always do these in half gallons. And again, this one right here is rhubarb and rose. It was just a way I could use up some of the excess rhubarb and rose petals I had. And this is the kind I might use on my hair. This was made from peach peels and pits. And then this one, I'm not sure if this was apple scraps or actually chunks of apple from juicing. But this one is going to be a raisin vinegar like I have here, which is a really great vinegar. But I decided I'm also going to add some of my apples, my dried apples from 2015. Now, since these dried things were never cooked, they were simply dried, I don't have to worry about the yeast on them being killed off. I'm going to go ahead and add everything that's left in this jar, because I have a lot of dried apples. And then I'm going to add some of my raisins. I can get a good price at Costco. That's where I get these. And this is a fairly new bag. I still got it jarred up. So I got a jar over here. So after I take some out of here, I'm going to put this in the jar and then vacuum seal it up. So anyway, these ones will be good for when you want to make a raisin vinegar. So I'm just going to throw, since I already have quite a few of the dried apples in there, I'm going to throw a couple handfuls of the raisins in. So you can see what that looks like right there. Now, if I was using fresh fruit, I would pretty much fill this at least 3/4 of the way up with fresh fruit, and then I'm going to add my water. Now, right off the bat, since those are more tart apples, I'm going to put in about a 1/4 cup of sugar to start with. Now, I've tried adding sugar halfway through the batch, like 2 weeks in. I find it easier just to add all the sugar when it comes to vinegar that I'm going to add right to the beginning, unless I think after a week or so into it, I think maybe it just seems it's not bubbly enough. Then I'll go ahead and add some more sugar at that point. Just like with wine, no, you don't want to add too much sugar at the beginning, or it can kill the, or prevent it from fermenting at all. So kind of think of it this way when it comes to sugar. Your ferments, they need carbs to feed off of, but too much sugar can kill them. Though they need the sugar, too much can be deadly. So that's what happened with, remember the Vinegar Scobie? I was trying to convert into a kombucha Scobie. I had to start all over because I made a mistake and I had some sugar water. I forgot there was already sugar in it, and then added some sugar, more sugar to it. It was too much sugar when I went to make a fresh batch using that same Scobie, and it ended up killing it. And so, yeah, it's not happy. I'm going to stir this around. Now, again, you can add a little bit of your older vinegar. You know, obviously, if this is a brand new batch and you've never made vinegar, you won't have that. Don't worry about it. It's not necessary. Another option would be to add a little bit of a fermentation starter if you already have one going. This one I just started yesterday. This is a raisin fermentation starter. I just did a video on all this, and it's already bubbly. I just started it yesterday. It's not really bubbly, it's not really active, but it's only been one day and it's already getting fizzy. But you could add some of this to help make sure that if you're concerned that that maybe it just needs a little something, add that in there to make sure you've got something in there that's going to get it going and get it fermenting. Because to make vinegar, it has to ferment, just like making wine. I'm going to add a little bit more water to this. Now again, no weights needed. I just need to remember to try to stir it, especially during the first week. It's important to stir it every day if you can remember, at least every other day. And then after that, just keep an eye on it. Once it gets to the point that the fruit starts to stay down below the surface, there's no need to keep stirring it. And then what will happen most of the time, especially if it's apples or peaches or pears, it's going to form a Scobie that's going to put its own little protective layer on there, and you don't have to worry about it. So now all I got to do is I'm going to go set this in the other room, which is typically where I do my vinegar making, and just every day try to remember to come in with my wooden spoon, which I usually keep. That's actually bamboo. I usually keep that with it. This is the only vinegar I'll have going for a change. For a while there, I had like about 20 of them or something on there because I was doing all those apple vinegars. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about too is, as you can see here, I've got, these are just 3 of my different vinegars. So the apple, the peach, and the rhubarb rose. I have like a rose lavender, you know, my floral vinegars. Those are the ones I typically use for washing my hair with. I do have a video, by the way, on the many uses of vinegar, so I'm not going to go over all that today. I'll just go ahead and link to that video down below if you're curious of all the different ways I use vinegar, because I have many gallons of vinegar already made up right now, mostly of apple, of course, but because we had a lot of apples this year. But anyway, something that I personally have never had to deal with, but people have asked me about, are vinegar worms or vinegar eels. They're not eels at all. They're a type of worm, kind of a parasite that lives off of the Scobie of your vinegar or your kombucha. Now, I've never had them, but they can happen. However, if you're just making vinegar, I wouldn't worry yourself too much about it, because just make sure that if you find it in there, that's the Vinegar Scobie. You don't want to save and reuse, just toss it. But don't throw out the vinegar. Just filter it through a fine cotton cloth or cheesecloth. And if any of those worms get in there, they're not going to hurt you. They're nothing to worry about. Honestly, they're totally, some people might just might be a little squeamish about it, so it's going to be up to you, but really you can filter them out through a fine cloth, no worries. But if you've got them in a kombucha Scobie, then you may need to check, and you've been keeping your kombucha Scobies, you've been, you know, letting them build up. Check all of your Scobies and see if you've got any clean ones. If they're all infested with the eels, you're going to want to toss them out. And this is why this is important, is because typically when you make kombucha, you got to keep using those scobies. It's not like making vinegar where you can start fresh and it will make its own scobie every time. With kombucha, you really need to have a scobie in there every time you start a fresh batch. So if your scobie is infested with eels, it's going to weaken and that SCOBY, because that's what it's feeding on. It's not feeding on the kombucha itself or the vinegar, it's feeding on the SCOBY itself. So you may have to start, if all of your scobies are infested, you're going to have to get a new one somewhere else, either from somebody else or buy one somewhere else. But if you have one that's not infested, then start with that one. Take any of the other ones that you have that have been infested and toss them and clean all your stuff really well. But again, with vinegar, I wouldn't worry about that too much, because like with me, I never save the scobies. And think of this, when you're throwing it to your chickens, that just gives them more protein if it's full of the vinegar eels. And then another thing that if you're wanting to know how acidic your vinegar is, here's the deal. The more sugar you use, typically you're going to get a higher acidity, but it's not just about that, because you don't want to overload it with sugar, or you can slow the ferment or even kill it. Just stop it in its tracks altogether if it has too much sugar. I've actually done that before, where I went and added sugar and it ended up halfway through the process and it ended up being too much, and it just stopped the process and it never went any further. It never actually turned to vinegar. It was just a somewhat fermented, very sugary liquid is all it was. So stirring it, again, I keep coming back to that, because I have found it to be, starting with a little more sugar right off the bat and then stirring it on a regular basis, I have found to be the best way to get a good high acidic vinegar that can be used from everything to cheese making to cleaning and so on and so forth. Well, how do you know if your vinegar is going to be acidic enough? One, it's not the best way. Everybody's going to say, no, this way's better and that way's better. But if you can at least get a good idea, I'm going to see if I can find these again. Last time I tried to find them to link to them, they were not available on Amazon. But I will try to find them and link below. But what you want to find is a good universal pH test strip. If it's universal, it's going to have usually a higher gauge that you can read, and it will measure at a higher rate too. And so what I have found, when I started using the stir method and a little bit more sugar, I was able to yield a pH of about 3.5, which is good, because 4.5 is the highest you want your pH to be, and that's somewhere in there is about your 5% acidity. So the lower the pH, the higher the acidity. So 3.5 is a really good place to be. And that's, 3.5 to 4.5 is the amount that you want for being able to do pretty much anything. If it's lower than that, or if the acidity is lower than that, the pH is higher, you might have a very weak vinegar, but it could still be good in other things. It could still be used in marinating and so forth. Like I've never tested my raisin vinegar, but my guess is, because it's not super sour, my guess is this one has got a higher pH than some of my newer vinegars. I've actually had this vinegar for a long time, because I haven't made raisin since my raisin vinegar video I did about 3 years ago. And back then, that was before I was stirring it. And I've had a lot of people come in on that video and say, because I never had problems with my raisins floating to the top and creating mold. They always just kind of either stayed at the bottom or floated up and down, where other people said all theirs floated to the top and went moldy. Well, didn't just stir it. Stir it as is needed. As you can see here, this one, the raisins right now are at the bottom, the apples are all at the top. Eventually these are all going to switch places. Either they'll all be at the top, or eventually they'll all be at the bottom. As long as I remember to stir it, it's no worries. But anyway, back to the pH strips. So if you get a good strip, you just take your strip, swirl it around in your vinegar, your finished vinegar, for just a few seconds, pull it out, and then within the first 15 seconds is when you want to read it. You're going to hold it up to your chart here, and what you want is right around in here. And the colors will change accordingly, and you'll know and then you'll see these numbers represent the pH level. And so the lower the pH, the higher the acidity. And so that way you'll know where you're at. I don't measure mine every time. Once I knew, I can tell by the smell and I can tell by the taste if it's the acidity I want. And you can also cut these in half to make them last longer, but it's not very expensive. I think it's like somewhere between $8 to $12 for a box of these. And I don't remember how many are in here, but I've had these for a long time and we just rarely use them. It is nice having them, and it was definitely nice getting them to start with as I was working with the vinegars. I'm trying to find a way to get a higher acidity in it, but once you get familiar with it, it's just like with the colloidal silver, you realize, okay, I don't need to test it every time. I know what it's supposed to look like, smell like, and taste like when it's done. And then periodically, it's still a good idea to go ahead and do a test just to see. Now, the only time I've ever had vinegar go bad where I had to toss it was vinegar that I tried making from apple peels and cores that I had frozen because I had so much vinegar going. I figured, well, I'll freeze the rest and then make vinegar later in the year. And that vinegar, though initially it seemed okay when it was finished, it just never got very strong. And then when I put it back in storage, the vinegar itself got moldy on top and it lost all its sourness, and it was gross. And if it's after you've strained everything out and it gets mold on it in storage, it's no good. Then you do need to toss it, because it's not like it's developing mold because it's got fruit sticking up out of it. It's developing mold on the liquid. That means it's not vinegar, because if it was vinegar, there's no way that mold could grow on there. And that's what happened with all the batches I made from the frozen apple scraps. And so I've never tried using frozen fruit since then. I'm not sure why it happened with those, but it was only the things that I had frozen. All my other vinegars have turned out fine. Some are stronger than others, especially my newer ones. That's when you'll know you have to throw it out. If it's no longer tart, if it's getting mold on it, on the vinegar itself, then it is bad and you need to toss it. You really haven't lost much if you ended up having to toss it anyway, because it's virtually free to make if you were using scraps like I did in that, and that I would have just thrown out to the chickens anyway. But most of the time your vinegar is going to be salvageable. You know, if it's still bubbly, if it tastes like wine and it didn't turn to vinegar, it can either be, you can either try to continue the process and have it turn to vinegar, or use that in something else. It's not a big deal, and nothing to freak out about. Just like that mold on top of your fruit when you're making the vinegar, shouldn't be worried about. But again, I'm going to say it again, stirring on a regular basis, I still believe, in my own experience and the different ways I've tried it, is the best way to do it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to check out my playlist for other ideas and ways that you can make vinegar using calendula, dandelion, lemons, citrus peels, and the different ways that I like to use the different varieties. All right, hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.